Thank you for joining us for another episode of Marking the Times. This is Dr. Mark Hitchcock. Again, I'm here in my office at Faith Bible Church in Edmond, Oklahoma. And all kinds of things kind of breaking in the news. We had the big debates, of course, the other night. The president and the first lady have COVID. So there's all kinds of things that are happening out there in the news today. But I think, one story that's kind of been buried with all that's been happening in the news, and I've kind of highlighted this along the way, but it is what's going on with Iran and with Israel. With all the big news that's happening, and certainly the elections kind of eclipsing everything else, that's kind of gone to the back burner, or maybe gone into the deep freeze, as people really aren't thinking much about the whole situation with Iran. That's the number one world sponsor of terror, the number one enemy of Israel, and of course continues to make threats against the U.S. And the elections really have a bearing upon all of this, because there's an article that I ran across in the Jerusalem Post just a month ago called "Will Israel Strike Iran?" And the subtitle says, "Could the prospect of U.S. elections prompt Israel to attack?" And I think a lot of people are forgetting the implications of what's going to happen in the Middle East, considering what happens in the elections. And Israel has been carrying out a lot of cyber strikes and a lot of conventional sabotage inside of Iran. And this has been deeply troubling to Iran. And, Iran's trying to think of ways, I think, probably to get back at Israel for this. But what's happening right now in Iran is something called the zone of immunity is increasing. And the zone of immunity is where Iran gets their nuclear facilities so well protected and so dispersed that any attack by Israel against them would be futile. And so the longer we go, the larger that zone of immunity becomes. Now, one of the things that's really interesting in all of this is, people are asking, well, is Israel going to launch some kind of a preemptive attack? We've talked about that a long time. And of course, this is all important because of what the Bible says in Ezekiel 38, that Iran is going to be part of these nations that attack Israel in the end time. So that's how this is all related to end time prophecy. But in this article, it says, add to this puzzle a Joe Biden presidency and a Democratic victory in Congress with the promised reversal from U.S. President Donald Trump's approach that withdrew from the nuclear deal and imposed maximal sanctions. Because Joe Biden has promised that he will re-engage with Iran and he will enter the Obama-era nuclear deal and ease sanctions really before renegotiating significant outstanding issues. And so Israel is watching this and thinking, okay, if Joe Biden's elected president and there's a Democrat Congress, Iran's going to be back into that nuclear deal. These sanctions are going to be reversed. And one of the important things in all of this that's been forgotten is under the Iran nuclear deal, Iran this October 18th was going to be guaranteed the right to not have an arms embargo against them anymore. They could go out and buy all the conventional weapons they wanted. And so if Joe Biden is elected and re-engages with that Iran nuclear deal, that will happen where Iran will be able to go out and buy all the conventional weapons they want. Now, recently, the U.S. did something very, very smart, very strategically important, and that is they initiated in the United Nations Security Council something called the snapback process, which snapped back all of these sanctions against Iran, which means on October 18th, they're not going to be able to go out and buy all the arms they want to buy. That arms embargo won't be lifted. And that's very important for the United States, but it's very important for Israel. But again, if Joe Biden's elected, he's going to re-engage in that. All those sanctions will go away. Iran will be able to purchase all the conventional weapons they desire. And of course, on the nuclear front, the time period for Iran to break out into nuclear capability has gone now from a year now just to several months. And so all that is to say, Israel's over there watching all of this. They're watching what Iran is doing on the nuclear front. They're watching this arms embargo against Iran, what's going to happen with that. They're watching the U.S. elections and what the result of that is going to be and how that will affect them. So all of that is playing into a decision that Israel's going to have to make at some point. Are they going to make some kind of a preemptive strike against Iran before that zone of immunity gets so broad that it really won't do any good? And all of that highlights the fact that when Israel does that, or if they do that, it's going to release all kinds of dominoes that will begin to fall in the Middle East. And on top of all that, of course, Israel has negotiated these normalization agreements with Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, which has Iran furious. So all of these things are happening right now, and they're kind of in the background now. But after the elections take place, I think a lot of things will begin to sort out. And depending on who's elected, I think is going to depend a lot on what Israel does strategically with Iran's nuclear program. So this is something you don't hear a lot about in the news right now. Everything else is just kind of overshadowing it. But it's very important for Israel. It's very important for the United States, and it's very prophetically significant. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this update, and we look forward to seeing you next time. God bless you. I hope you have a good week.